you. I'm going to introduce our session together. I talked briefly about it yesterday when we talked about the days of study days. What we're doing is part of a research program focusing on the social responsibility of sports journalism. 3 teams worked on this project and have fed into what we're going to be doing today. Béatrice, Eugènie, and myself have been working on the conditions of sports reporting on television. Particularly interesting, very often the question is asked, how do we apply what we saw yesterday? But it's not something that is surveyed a lot by journalists, by journalism bodies. On location, in production situation, who are the different professionals that are involved in all of this? How do they work together? And the question is, how do the priorities given to diversity that we talked about yesterday and this morning, how are they taken into account in practical terms? Very wide, very broad topic, including recruitment, training, journalism, and other, there's not just journalism, and outside constraints that we've already been talking about this morning, particularly the editorial approach, the technical means. That is a reminder that we must not be only focused on the media, but journalists are part of a sports context. Much wider system, the cultural system as well needs to be taken into account. So we carried out a survey between 2015 and 2017 using 4 different methods, complementary methods that we've put up on the board here. So on-site, on location, we've been observing the editorial process, biographical survey interviews, either journalists or production heads. And journalists, it was the widest possible definition of the term. And then observing ethnographic observations, both European championships and world championships of athletics. And then debriefing conversations based on the anthropological observations, asking questions, going on location, and asking for feedback, flexi feedback as to what we've been able to observe. So these are complementary methods that allow us to present what we're doing, but also give us observations as to the work that has been carried out on the field. And finally, and that will be the end of the methodology, we worked with several channels, several public and private television channels, different rights to broadcast different events. What we see here is we also try to vary the viewpoints, whether it be from the editorial point of view or the journalism point of view, different participants. We spent entire days with the different actors of sports television, either in the production booth or in the stadium. We followed a lot of press conferences to find out in real terms what the different points of view are. We also were working in the perspective of both French and Italian TV channels, as well as Spanish TV channels, and that's why our colleague is here today, presenting how they work. Then we'll end up with England and the BBC that we already talked about a bit previously. So the objective for us is not just to list the different constraints. We already did that this morning. TV channels have audience constraints, viewer constraints. We need to look at how these constraints and the different evolutions, whether it be digital, economic constraints, how all these are going to evolve, are going to change the way that the different participants interact and influence final production. That's what we tried to show here. So I'm going to try to go a bit faster. Before Béatrice explains how things evolved, just to remind you how it works. So a TV channel is going to send a team to an event. There is a signal that is produced by a local broadcaster, and that the channels will be able to pick up on the images, depending on what rights they have acquired. So this is the Rai TV. This is how they work. This is what it looks like. You're going to have this diagram of the stadium and the different studios for each channel where they are. This is a question of choice. Each channel will have the opportunity to set it up. This is the Rai Studio control booth, France Télé booth. These are different spaces, different setups that depend on money, on how many people are going to be there, consultants, and how they're going to be seated. That will influence production, the way that the dialogue, the discussion will happen. Here's another example with a studio setup that is much bigger, and other choices will have been carried out. Athletes will come out and will walk along a certain path. So it's very important that you have a good positioning. If all the athletes were to stop each stage, the organization, the spatial organization is going to have an impact on production. That's what I'm trying to show. That's from above. You can see how the athletes go past the production booths. And to finish, everything's going to be transmitted to the vehicles, the production vehicles, and the producers will have access to all the images that are transmitted from those different places on location in the stadium. Laurent will look at it more later, but this is an example from the BBC. No, this is Rai, not BBC. So you see within the vehicles, studio vehicles, organized differently. So there are the constraints of all the images that are going to be received. The study that we carried out, we won't have time to go into detail, but it's a description, fine description of the production process, and at the same time an analysis of the constraints. We're not going to go back over all of the different factors that take part, that participate in the job of a journalist. We've seen them in other workshops, organizational ones, sectorial ones, and editorial aspects. And we need to take account of all of these factors in our analysis. In the first part, we're going to talk about the consequences of obtaining or not the rights to broadcast a sports event. And then we'll be looking at some of the features, the editorial features of sports information. So getting the rights or not. Sports information depends a lot on property, on broadcasting property and rights, budgets granted to teams, and technical means that are deployed on location, and the organization of teams and the way work is organized. So sports, those in charge of sports departments who need to decide who to send on location, and they will take account of these constraints in deciding that. They will determine this based on considerations like the how managerial principles are applied, skills of the technicians that they have, and collective functioning, how the teams work together, journalism sociology, how the journalism profession works, friendships between journalists, but also competition. I don't have time to look into the sociology of journalism. There's lots of rivalry. And in this, particularly in TV, and in this context, for instance, when all the means that are provided for a journalist to be chosen for an event is to position oneself, to carry out programs about athletes that are going to be important from a media point of view when it comes to choosing them. So they'll have worked with the athletes before. So also the choice of consultants requires certain different factors, technical skills, the eloquence, and also public notoriety and the recognition. Sometimes politics and policies between channels are also factors that enter into account. Based on all these different features and elements, we tried to put together an outline of all the different channels that we worked with. Two models for the TV channels that have acquired broadcasting rights for sports events. They produce their own content on site, and they have editorial leaders on site, on location. And these are the channels that have the right to broadcast. So television rights, we talked about that this morning. The first case for these channels who have acquired rights for broadcasting, the first case scenario is very few people positioned on location. They are permanent employees, and they then bring in consultants, reporters, who will be used for a specific event, maybe only employed for that event. These channels do not produce magazine formats. They are focused on real-time live broadcasting with exclusive images that they have paid for. They have paid to have their cameras positioned in certain places in the stadium. What's interesting, and a lot of people work with interviews in the mixed area between athletes and the rest of the participants. And the way that work is organized, these are channels that have a tendency to organize on-site production events on-site, production conferences on-site. There are other channels that work with teams that have a much greater distinction between the different professionals. They work less with outside operators and technicians. They don't have daily conference, editorial conferences, but they work with WhatsApp a lot, and they do not necessarily separate the commentary from the presentation of the event. This is something that the first type of channel don't do. These are both channels that have acquired rights. Then there are the channels who have not acquired rights, but who may have agreements with a chain that does, and they will lend them accreditation. Or channels who have chosen, who don't have the right to broadcast, but who may have exclusive rights to talk to the athletes outside of the game, outside of the stadium. SFR this summer at the World Athletics Championship, they had insides. They had access to the hotel of the athletes. None of the other channels had access to those accommodation, for instance, of the athletes. So these channels are recognized by their teams on location, made up of camera, video recording technicians. They often are just brought in for events, maybe just contracts. They aren't permanent employees. How do these small teams? The instructions are given from Paris or another major city by telephone. They produce sound and images, and they send them straight to the base in Paris or somewhere else. Mixing and editorial work is carried out at the base of the headquarters of the channel, and they use radio, web, and TV. The head of production is in Paris, and that person decides what gets broadcast. And these channels focus on commentary, not much studio presentation because they don't have the on-location means to do it, and they don't have live interviews of athletes. So their teams are very limited in what they can do. They go to press conferences. They can't film wherever they want. There's a lot of accreditation issues. They need to be very flexible and grant a lot of flexibility to their producers because the teams are so small. Going to go to the second part, channel communication, TV channel communication. Having the rights or not is, do they acquire the rights? It depends on whether they grant a lot of value to the event itself. So they need to be sure that they're going to make a profit on the investment to acquire the rights. This occurred. This was set up by the early sports broadcasting events like bicycle racing. A lot of media companies, including public ones, need to just think through the issue. They have a product. Can they make a profit on it? And it is an information product, so they need to take account of all the different constraints. So they have different targets, different objectives, presenters, consultants, journalists, and they need to focus also on the athletes and the event itself. We've got a few examples here. This isn't anything to do with what we're saying. Here we go. Communications leaders of the different communication heads of the different channels for the written press will and TV want to ask all. They will be consulted by the TV by the editor. This summer at the World Championship, we're going to be, for instance, focusing on certain athletes like Diagana. We need to focus on whether or not rights are acquired, what is the positioning of the channel. It's going to be done by personalizing the public figures that are either consultants or journalists. Consultants will be granted more recognition, for instance, during the publicity advertising slots. It's not just on television that's interested in this aspect, but it's radio as well. When a TV channel comes, it's much easier to show. So we're going to be able to make use of this feature, and the TV channel will develop a discourse, managerial discourse, in terms of its journalism. All the expressions around journalism to give value and recognition to names of people, particularly on social media, social networks. Not just the athletes and their names, but also the journalists and the consultants. No matter what country, no matter what channel, there is a real teasing approach, depending on the investment, trying to bring in extra viewers. We're going to hear things like, now we're going to broadcast a teaser as for the final championship, the final event. It's an approach that the people on location are going to take account of, and they're going to propose these to the editors, and they're going to say, right, we want to increase the pressure, the media pressure, and focus more on such and such an athlete just before the final ultimate point of the event. This might be at the expense of the diversity of the athletes, and there will be choices made focusing on athletes that are most profitable, that the viewers are most interested in seeing, and the ones that have the highest viewer recognition. And this is journalists need to take account of this. They have to have their own followers on social media. They need to develop their own profession. Does a given journalist have access to a sufficiently high number of high recognition athletes? A young French athlete, is it, for instance, will Rai have access to athletes who aren't just Italian athletes? And this will have a big impact on the career of journalists. Communication is not at all new. What is new? There's only 5 minutes left. What is new is that the interaction between the different participants is much more present and a bigger constraint on editorial choices, and will constrain the role of journalism within these choices. We've shown a few examples here. What you see at the bottom involves Italy, federations, but sponsors and athletes themselves will each have agents, communication operators who are there to help the journalists, and helping them is telling them what they need to go and see, what events are most interesting and important. These people will suggest a choice and help journalists select the events that they cover and the approaches. These are constraints that they will take account of. We're talking here about athletics still. It's much more important. It's much more obvious than in football. This was Infoscom. There's a lot of constraints, a lot of journalists. You have 2 minutes for each media to get some exclusive footage. Also, in terms of the image, in order to get an image that is not the same as all the other channels, therefore there's going to be a lot of care put into the choice of location and space. It'll be more complicated. The main point of encounter between channels, TV channels, and the federations, the sponsors, etc., is going to be on the focus of sports and how to enhance its recognition. This is what Réjeanne was saying yesterday, talking about the win-win situation. Everybody will win if we are focused on increasing recognition of sport around shared values, particularly athletics. How do we increase the recognition of athletics, for instance, compared to football? It's something that comes up every now and then. Just a few examples. Sporadically, we can observe this. I think of hammer throwing and other things. I'll let you finish now. Even for channels that have acquired rights, and this is the constraint of the journalist's job, most of the information, raw material, is not produced by journalists. The choice, and this will influence the choice of topics and the people who are interviewed. The place of the images being provided by the host is very important, a major consideration, particularly in terms of the accreditation. Access zones are imposed by the organizer of the event. These conditions depend on commercial contracts signed with the channels, added on into all the previous contracts we've talked about up to now. Channels need to decide where they will position their cameras. There can be a certain margin of maneuver for those who are willing to pay more, who can have different camera coverage within a given space. Different types of accreditation provided for journalists, providing different access to different zones. Some teams have no real access, which has an incidence on where films can be made. Some journalists can work only in the press area, others in the stadium itself. So the idea is to get around the rules that are imposed by the transmission authorities. They're going to hide a camera to try to get into the public, and maybe film the family of an athlete or the trainers.
Sometimes this will create a lot of friction with the sources. For example, there is a dispute between journalists on a particular channel and a federation on the locations that federation thinks is unauthorized filming location, and this breach could be reported up to management and even lead to the legal department being engaged. So, for example, the treatment area for athletes are off limits to journalists, but sometimes they manage to sneak in and do a report, and in that case there will be a reaction, or they expect a reaction. In London this summer, For example, there were the channels had to sign up to conditions which highlighted the difficulty of access to athletes, because in order to access the warm-up area for athletes, they had to sign up the day before at a particular time on a site, and it was on a first-come, first-served basis. But the slot that you got bore no relationship to any particular athlete in the warm-up area, which made it difficult to film for a particular topic, for example. So before handing back, the other key finding is that the economic aspects which influence production, and we try to see what effect these impacts will have. And in fact, what we saw, that it was almost never any discussion about what news or what is newsworthy. There are a lot of focus on routines, and basically the choice is set up beforehand. There are well-known athletes, well-known events, and that is what comes up. So thirdly, as some kind of conclusion, hopefully, as you will have understood, production of sports news and coverage with these constraints that you have had described to you by Béatrice and Sandy, be it in terms of communications policies of sports bodies or channel policies, are there, but we have not yet discussed what happens within these constraints, about what the technicians and journalists actually do on site. So the third aspect in this research is understanding how, in this confined space, programs, athletics programs that you see are made. For example, on the World Athletics Championships. So, talking in particular about channels with broadcasting rights, many conclusions focus on RAI because we could not do comparative studies across all the channels that we looked at. So the question is, how does media cover a sports event once you have it has the broadcasting rights, and how do they stand out in their coverage? How do you do a made in Italy coverage for RAI, made in France for France Télévisions, and so forth? So, for instance, there is the editorial policy, which will direct the work of the journalists on the spot, so including but not limited to live coverage in particular, highlighted in different ways, desire to promote national athletes that are not necessarily medal winners and not being covered by the international signal broadcast by the national operator, and so forth. So these guidelines will affect the news manufacturing coverage. In addition, and this is where comparison between sports could be of value, this athletics is quite complex because there are a number of different events happening at the same time. There are a range of rules. Each event has its own rules, with a large number of athletes from all over the world taking part. So there is also an emphasis on a particular sport or a particular way of covering athletics television. And during coverage of this type of live show, there are two sorts of timing. Sometimes there is too much going on to comment, and at other times there are downtimes when there is not so much going on, and the coverage will be put together in a different way. So when there's too much, the issue is what prioritization is applied to images being broadcast with a maximum of 2 simultaneous shots. So only 2 disciplines can be covered at any one time. So there's a whole load of criteria which we have identified. For instance, performance, so broadcast images of potential medal winners or finalists, national preference with the broad wide-angle cameras will go for national athletes of the channel filming. Other issues are if you have no images to comment on, and how you can kind of fill out the available space with sound and perhaps other images, and this regularly comes up during this type of events. Another issue is the creation of content as regards the assignment of responsibilities between content creators to understand what is the script of a typical day's broadcast. How does it begin? How does it progress? How does it wrap up? And to see how the various contents that you have seen are produced in different locations in and out of the stadium, with journalists in varying roles, and how all this is tied together. I could say in conclusion about RAI that I felt the production values were extremely routine, with implicit understanding between the various players in this complex production process, with the editorial policy, technical and production orientations, a practical grasp of sports news, which derives from the professionals, journalists that have extensive professional experience in the in athletics coverage. Another point which struck me with RAI was the role of the managing editor, the only journalist who is in the production room at RAI, and they are the conductor of the orchestra that puts together the content, that has the final say. So this is a extremely pyramid type structure of decision making. And my final question is, does this pyramid or practical grasp of organization and strict division of labor that I observed between the different players in this process are necessary conditions for developing content in the specific context of live coverage with technical, demanding technical requirements?
Merci beaucoup.